In October 1949, the Chinese people celebrated the victory of the Communist Party. The leader of the Communists and the hero of the revolution was Mao Zedong. For Mao and the Chinese Communist Party, taking power was just a first step. The real revolution was about to begin. In 1949, China lay devastated by decades of civil war and foreign invasion. The previous regime, corrupt and incompetent, had left the country bankrupt. People hoped the new communist government would bring unity and peace, pride and prosperity.
Everybody felt that the liberation in 1949 was an historic demarcation. Before that, it was the old society with many ugly things in it. After the communists came, most people were idealistic and they began to fight for the same cause, for a new China.
Mao and his colleagues had a vision of momentous change. They wanted to transform the lives of 1/4 of mankind and create a strong and modern industrial China. The communists forged a new political structure. They set up a network of party branches which reached down from the capital to every village in the country. At local levels, officials explained party programs.
Communism meant political equality for everybody. The people would be masters of the country. That was the propaganda. People would have enough to eat and wear. Poverty would be a thing of the past.
The reforms went far beyond economics, into personal relations.
Well, hello everyone. So today we're going to review what we've learned so far about China and its communist revolution and what happened after the communists took over. Remember that the people of China had been through a lot before Mao Zedong came around and gave them lots of promises about a great future, just like the lady there was just explaining. But the sad thing is that really Mao and everybody in the Communist Party was actually lying to everyone, and what really would come to China would be nothing but people losing their freedom and eventual death of millions and millions of people.
The communists organized people into work units, which provided employment, health care, housing, and education. Work units also gave the party direct control over people's lives.
Everyone belonged to a work unit. At first, people weren't comfortable with them, but gradually they got used to them.
In the countryside, the changes were just as profound. For centuries, most peasants had struggled to survive hardship and poverty. During the revolution, Mao had won peasant support with promises of a better life. Across China, hundreds of thousands of landlords were killed. Nearly half of all China's arable land was distributed to poor peasants.
Before land reform, we only had 3/4 of an acre of land. It was not enough to feed us all. During land reform, we got nearly 3 acres of land. Because we had more land, we could grow more. Gradually, our life became better.
Now it was the people who were the masters. They really liked that. Land and houses were taken from the landlords and given to them. People saw that they benefited, so they supported the Communist Party.
So one of the first things that they did was take all of the land in China, and now the government owned all of the land in China, and then they gave it to poor peasants, which sounds like a good thing to do, but what they were doing was actually killing the people who owned the land before. So right off the bat, we see death in communist China.
Now it began a series of smaller campaigns against people inside China, people Mao called enemies without guns. Party officials encouraged people to act as informers using special letterboxes. The Jiang family had one of many small businesses still operating in Wuhan.
My in-laws were capitalists. They were told to report all their property to the government.
So
they made an inventory of everything in the store. Later, there was a struggle meeting.
The
shop assistants tied up my mother-in-law because they didn't like her. They yelled at her. My brother-in-law got impatient and said, "We don't have anything more. You keep saying we have more, but we don't." Then they tied him up too, saying he had a bad attitude. What we used as our dinner table was actually a bench, this long. They told her to kneel on it. It's very hard to kneel on a bench like that. If you bend just a little, you fall. You have to stay very straight to kneel on it. They kept us there until 11 at night. They really couldn't get any more out of us.
Thousands were jailed or executed. People with money, with foreign connections, or with ties to the previous regime. With these campaigns, the communists crushed all potential political opposition.
And so, just like that, people who disagreed with the Communist Party were attacked, punished heavily, or even in some cases killed. But people who followed the Communist Party, as it's going to tell you in a little bit, got to live nice, peaceful parts of the city where they had lots of money.
The leaders and their families lived in Zhongnanhai, a huge walled compound in the heart of Beijing. They spent their summers at the same beach resort, reserved for high officials. With the help of Soviet advisors, Mao's government began dozens of huge industrial projects. This development and Soviet help had to be paid for. Mao looked to China's peasants to foot the bill. But traditional family farms could not produce enough to pay for industry. In 1953, the communists began to socialize agriculture. First, they encouraged families to pool their property in small farms called cooperatives.
When you explained clearly to people what it meant to till the land together, with people working together, we would have more manpower and we would be able to increase production and our life would become better. When people accepted this, a few families started working together.
And so Mao forced everyone to move into what would be called work units or communes, where they didn't have the option to pick what they wanted to do for their job. They didn't have the option to pick where they would live, and they were forced to live in the areas that the government had decided for them to live.
Seizing the momentum, he ordered the country to move to the next stage of socialism, to collectivization. But for most peasants, this was going too far. In collectives, private property was abolished. People had to give up their animals, their tools, and their land. Party officials put intense pressure on families to join.
By then, people were unhappy. They weren't comfortable forming a collective with the whole village. Some villagers didn't get on with others. My father was quite well off, so he didn't want to join either. I was a party official in the village. I told him if I weren't an official, I wouldn't insist he join. If you didn't join, you wouldn't look good in front of your neighbors. With my persuasion and the example of others, he gave in. But he joined with reluctance. His income was quite high. It went down after he joined, so he was unhappy.
Within months, all of China's 600 million peasants were working in huge collectives. For the first time in history, the farm output of the entire nation was under government control. The government decided how much grain the peasants could keep. The rest had to be sold at low prices to the state.
The grain ration for the peasants was very low, not enough. Plus, you had to obey the leadership. You had to fulfill the state quota. State first, then the people.
Peasants complained about the policies.
They said, we can't keep one extra ear of grain for ourselves. Do you think this is fair? I said, it's not fair. So I wrote to the provincial leadership. Things couldn't go on like this. No matter how much you grew, you still had to give it to the state. You couldn't eat it. The province sent people down to investigate. They saw things were just the way I said, but they couldn't solve it. It was a big problem.
Collectives did not make the peasants better off, nor did they increase production. Mao still had to find a way to finance his vision of an industrial China. Mao's first concern was still China's economy. Industrial output had doubled in 5 years, but he was not satisfied.
Mao Zedong always hoped to build a socialist economy in China faster than the Soviet Union.
In 1958, Mao launched his most ambitious campaign to date, the Great Leap Forward. His goal was to make China the industrial equal of Western nations in just 15 years. His method was to mobilize the entire country to work day and night by promising a better future.
We built reservoirs, planted cotton, cultivated trees, and things like that. When we worked, we had a slogan. Catch the stars and moon. We had to work when the stars and moon were out.
We had breakfast very early and came home very late. So we worked all day long. We were so enthusiastic. To make work exciting, flags flew high in the fields and loudspeakers squealed. People shouted slogans one after another.
Mao decided to visit some villages to see what was going on. I went with him. Once we came to a village and saw a banner with these words on it. People's communes are good. He read the words. People's communes are good. A reporter happened to be next to Mao and took down his words. The next day, the words appeared in the newspapers. That's how People's Commune started.
Mao's word was so powerful that almost overnight, people's communes sprang up across China. A commune encompassed many villages with thousands of families. Each day was strictly regimented, and family life was virtually abolished. Children were placed in communal nurseries while their parents worked around the clock. People ate in the fields or in communal dining halls.
So as you can see, the people who were living on the communes, and pretty much the same would be true for the work units, they weren't even allowed to see their own kids, really. They worked pretty much all day. The children were raised by kind of as a group, so you didn't raise your own children. People had to live and eat while they were working. They didn't really have lives of their own. They didn't really have families. They couldn't enjoy themselves at all.
They also wanted to increase farm output.
How could we increase the grain harvest? People said that if you did close planting and used more fertilizer, you would definitely increase output. People got carried away. They were hot-headed. From Mao Zedong and the Central Party Committee down to leaders at all levels, everyone was full of enthusiasm.
During the Great Leap Forward, we believed miracles could happen. There was a saying, the corn will grow higher the more you desire. Communes and schools reported their wonderful news to the party. If one commune said they could turn out 150 tons an acre, another one would say their target was 180 tons. Each commune or school would promise a higher amount until the last school gave their highest figure. Our school set the target of 470 tons an acre. We dug a hole, something like a swimming pool. We thought if we put all the fertilizer in it, we would achieve our target. Then we poured the seeds in, which built up into a layer about this thick. There was a photograph in the People's Daily that showed the wheat in a field supporting the weight of children.
Some leaders of the Central Party Committee were so happy that they put this photo on their desks at work. Most people believed it.
We were surprised to see that photo and wondered how it could be possible. But because we were city people, we couldn't be sure it was a fake.
When I went with Mao to the villages, I really did see so much grain in the fields, so much rice. The yields were so high. At the time, I thought everything was true.
After the anti-rightist campaign, few dared to ask questions.
Only one teacher spoke out. How thick would the wheat be if we did produce 470 tons? Immediately, he was accused of being a rightist and not believing in the party.
Later, I learned it was all fake. The peasants were putting on a show for us. They moved grain from other places and put it all in one field. It was all a show for Mao.
Under pressure to produce more, to launch satellites to heaven, as it was called, party officials inflated production figures. An ominous cycle began as the state took more and more grain based on false figures, leaving the peasants with nothing to eat.
For example, the output was 5 tons of grain, but 10 tons were reported. Then the state would collect grain based on 10 tons.
Our commune committee calculated that our yield was 1,800 pounds an acre. It didn't qualify us to go up to heaven. But the deputy had an idea. He added the melons, fruits, pears, peaches, turnips, and vegetables to the grain, counting them as grain output. So the yield became 2,600 pounds per acre. Now we were qualified to go up to heaven. The commune committee did not want to calculate this way. It was cheating. But those people were higher up. What could we do? I have this problem. I get emotional very easily. I wondered why the higher the official, the more he dared to lie, to deceive the party and the people. Zhang Hongbin, the financial secretary, was horrified when he heard such an enormous figure. He said, "Are you letting people eat? This is sheer absurdity."
Party officials ignored the protests and continued to submit the inflated figures. The state took the grain accordingly. It was sent to feed the cities, repay Soviet debts, or left to rot in warehouses. Peasants across China were beginning to starve.
Anhui was one of the 4 provinces worst hit. All my mother could do was gather weeds with my aunt. There wasn't enough grain, so we ate weeds.
So because no one wanted to let the Communist Party down, they kept telling lies about how much food that they were able to grow. And what they said was that actually the regular people who had farmed it said, no, we don't want to lie about how much food we made, because then they're going to take all the food that we made away from us. But the leaders, the ones that be just right above them in power in terms of the Communist Party, they were like, no, we're going to lie about this because we don't want to look bad by the ones above us. And they knew what was going on, and they continued to take the food away. And as you can see, the guy was very emotional. People starved to death.
Nobody had the courage to oppose Mao Zedong. He was considered absolutely correct. He stood high and looked far. People thought they were not up to Mao's level. Even if someone wanted to make a comment, he would not dare say anything or reveal his own feelings.
As a result, production goals were not cut. Officials continued to demand more grain than the peasants could give. The Great Leap Forward continued through 1960. Millions of peasants were starving.
Old peasants said in a fury, "No, grain comes from the blood and sweat of peasants. It doesn't grow on the backs of intellectuals. Who do they think they're fooling?" In wartime, we protected them and saved their lives. Now we provide them with food and clothing. They have full stomachs, and still they come to cheat us. Don't they have a conscience?
My aunt's family was a typical big family in the countryside, with several generations living together. There were 36 people altogether. During the 3 years of famine, one died after another. Eventually, only 3 people were left alive. At first, when someone died, they would take the body and bury it. Later, they didn't have the strength to take the bodies out. They could only look at them. They watched the bodies being eaten by rats and their eyeballs dug out. People didn't even have the strength to chase the rats away.
The famine was very severe and widespread, but newspapers did not report it at all. People only knew that their local area was suffering. To keep the news from spreading, peasants were not allowed to leave their areas, even to beg.
At first, peasants ate everything they had at home. Then they ate Genyan earth. It's a kind of white clay. There's a legend in the village, passed down from generation to generation. It says that this clay was provided by Old Mother Genyan, who sympathized with the poor people. People would eat it during the famine because it was very fine. But still, it was hard to swallow. At first, the peasants could swallow a little. But after 4 or 5 days, it destroyed their intestines, and they died. After eating all the grass roots and tree bark, they ate the earth.
The famine lasted 3 years. An estimated 30 million people died. Mao's revolution, fought to give the Chinese people a better life, had helped create the largest famine in history.
So people, they ate dirt, and if you eat dirt, your body cannot digest it. It will basically clog your insides and you'll die. And that's what happened. They had no other option.
In May 1966, Mao began an attack on the party. Through the columns of China's main newspaper, he called on young people to attack party officials and replace them with true revolutionaries. Mao Zedong had unleashed the great proletarian cultural revolution.
For the first time since 1949, our supreme leader, Chairman Mao, a godlike figure, called on people at the very bottom of society. People like us students with no work and no profession.
And so after so many people started to starve to death, the people who were around before Mao Zedong took power started to say, hey, you know what? It was not perfect before when we had the emperor. It was not perfect whenever we had Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen and everybody else who was trying to give us freedom, who was trying to give us democracy. It was not that great when Japan invaded and we had war going on, but it was better than this. At least we didn't have millions and millions of people starving to death because of the way that our government decided to run things. Okay, because the government said something, everyone had to follow that, and as a result, people died. Okay, there was no way around that. And so because of that, they started to try to erase that history and get rid of the memories of that time. And so they used younger people who were students, college students, who hadn't known any of the world that was before communism, that was before Mao Zedong. So it was very easy to convince to start to destroy the history and even kill people and beat them and things like that.
Young people took to the streets. They wrote wall posters attacking their teachers and party officials. Within days, schools and universities were in turmoil. Having launched the Cultural Revolution, Mao left Beijing. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping were left to manage the growing disorder.
Chairman Mao says, Marxism consists of thousands of truths, but they all boil down to one phrase: it's right to rebel.
Students banded together to carry out Mao's orders. They called themselves Red Guards. On August 18, 1966, Mao began a series of public appearances, greeting millions of young people in Tiananmen Square. Donning the armband of the Red Guards, Mao gave them his blessing.
We saw Mao wave to us. He said something, but we couldn't hear clearly. Later we learned that he said we should carry on the Cultural Revolution to the end.
Mao encouraged the Red Guards to attack Western influences and to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. Without this destruction, he said, socialism cannot be achieved. The Red Guards tore down street signs and put up new revolutionary names. They ransacked museums, libraries, and temples. They searched and looted people's homes.
At first, they took my books, together with a bookcase. The second time, they searched for money. There were things that would get me in trouble. Later, they took the sewing machine and sofa, even the desk. There was no reason for it. My children were scared to death, shaking with fear.
Groups of Red Guards roamed the countryside, urging peasants to attack local officials.
So why does it matter then that they burned books, that they took things from writers, that they tore down road signs, that they renamed places, buildings, and businesses, and parks, and roads? Why does that even matter? Let's talk about that for a little bit.
Throughout China, party officials, intellectuals, people with foreign connections, former businessmen, millions were paraded and beaten in public. It is estimated that at least 400,000 people were killed.
400,000 people were killed, okay? That's just in that one incident that they're talking about. But how many times have we heard in this video so far today about people being killed and hundreds of thousands of people being killed, let alone the millions of people who starved to death in the Great Leap Forward? So think about this. Were the Chinese Communist Party's policies good or bad? Did it help China? Did it help the Chinese people? What do you think? And you were looking at video right now of Hong Kong, where they were back right before coronavirus started coming around in Hong Kong protesting. Everyone, pretty much all of the people of Hong Kong you can see are out in the streets protesting the takeover of China. So really nothing has changed in that sense. People are still afraid of China because they do control so much. They control everything within China. And people want their freedom. They don't want to give that up.
In my class, there was a student whose grandfather had owned a big fabric store, so he was a capitalist. I heard that everyone was to go to their house to criticize him. I got there late, and by the time I arrived, the capitalist had been beaten to death. I remember that his head was all swollen and dark and bruised. I didn't look for long, and then we all left. But later I learned that this capitalist was killed after my classmates got there. Other students and probably Red Guards from the neighborhood also got involved. All those people beat him to death, including his own granddaughter, my classmate. I didn't think much about it then because this kind of thing happened a lot. But years later, I thought about it many times and I wanted to find an answer. The question was very difficult. It was, if I had not arrived late, what would I have done? Would I have beaten him? He was a capitalist, but at the same time he was a man, an old man. I have never been able to answer this question.
Wow. And I think that's pretty powerful. Now, what do you think? What would you have done? Would you have followed and done what everybody else was doing? Or would you have stopped and thought about it and done what you knew was right? Because remember that violence is never the answer. Hurting someone, killing someone, beating someone, tearing things down is never the answer. The answer is peace. The answer is free elections, voting, everyone giving their own voice. So it's never okay to hurt people. So let's go ahead and take some time to talk about what we've seen today, what we've talked about the last few days, and kind of put it together and think about how you can apply it to your life.